Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be introducing the Epistle of James in our continuing study of the general epistles. James chapter 1, verse 1, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, notice he's writing to the 12 tribes who were dispersed abroad, greetings. As we get into this epistle, we're going to be seeing some of the problems that we're facing the New Testament church, and especially this branch of the New Testament church, those that are represented by the 12 tribes. First of all, they're going through suffering and persecution. That's going to be mentioned in the epistle. There's a partiality among them where they're treating the wealthy better than they're treating the poor people. There's a lack of commitment that James is going to address as he writes to them. There's an issue of pride that's built into that, and there's some strife going on within the church. It's not necessarily the believers versus the outsiders. That's there in the suffering and persecution, but there's also some things going on internally. Does that sound familiar? Those are still issues. Those are still issues that the church wrestles with today. And finally, materialism. Again, a 21st century issue in a first century book. Now, some characteristics of this particular epistle. First of all, there's a real lack of personal notes. The writer introduces himself in verse 1 and will not talk about himself throughout the rest of the epistle. There's little mention made of Jesus Christ. He's mentioned here in verse 1. He's going to be mentioned again in chapter 2, verse 1, and that's about it. This isn't really going to be an epistle about Jesus. Instead, this is going to be an epistle that gives the teachings of Jesus. We'll talk more about that next time. But for now, let's notice also that there's an absence of a mention of any Gentiles within the church. It's not that the issue is there and ignored. It's as though there aren't any Gentiles yet, perhaps, that are in the church. Christianity is not presented in contrast with Judaism. It's as though they're the same at this point. At least that seems to be the view taken. Now, the Epistle of James, we're going to give a short outline. It begins in chapter 1, where once you get to verse 2, the writer talks about asking God for wisdom. If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, and it's going to be given him. And then we transition to the issue of hearing and doing the word. This is verses 19 through 27, the rest of chapter 1. That don't just be a hearer of the word, be a doer of it. And so once you get God's wisdom, put it into practice. Then there's that problem that we mentioned a minute ago with the problem of partiality, where the poor people are not being treated as well as the rich people in the assembly of God's people. So that's chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. Then that leads to another way of really saying that leads to the issue of faith and works. Because their faith says one thing, and their works are saying something else. Not just in the issue of partiality, but maybe in other areas too. Next we talked about hearing and doing the word. Now we talk about taming the tongue. In other words, taming the word that comes out of your mouth. Taming the tongue, that's chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. And finally, chapter 3, verses 13 through 18, again, there's an emphasis upon wisdom, which means this whole section, we can view this whole section as chiastic, that we started with wisdom and we come with a reference to wisdom at the end, but that's not the end of the epistle. Now that we've asked for wisdom from above, we now begin to get elements of that wisdom, and they come in a series of warnings. Warnings over quarrels and conflicts, that's chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. Warnings against arrogant boasts, chapter 4, verses 11 through 17. Warnings against the rich, chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And finally, warning about the need for prayer. And that's going to be the Epistle of James. So, James chapter 1, verse 1 starts off introducing the author, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. And as we saw just a minute ago, it tells us to whom it's written, to the 12 tribes. But who is this person, James? James, or as the Greek text would have, Jacobus. sounds a little bit like the name Jacob, and actually that's much closer. I'm not entirely sure why we translate it James. Probably we're trying to anglicize the sort of the English version of that name, but his name was really, we would say Jacob, Jacobus, and it's a very common name. Well, of course, there's the Jacob in the Old Testament, but it's a common name in the New Testament. After all, it was the father of their country. And so you have James, the brother of John, the one who, they were both sons of Zebedee. There's also James, the son of Alphaeus. Both of these first two James, were both disciples of Jesus. There's also James, the half-brother of Jesus. He's mentioned as such in Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, where Paul refers to him as the half-brother of Jesus. There is James, the son of Mary. Maybe not one of those others, maybe a separate one. And finally, there's James, the father of Jude, mentioned in Acts chapter 1, verse 13. That sounds like still another. Very common name. Which one was this one? I think, and I'm not alone here, I think that perhaps this is James, the half-brother of Jesus. You see, when we read about him and the other brothers of Jesus, Matthew chapter 13, verse 54 tells the story where when Jesus was coming to his hometown, he began teaching them in their synagogue. That would have been a little tiny place. I'm actually standing here as I show you this picture in a rebuilt version of the synagogue at Nazareth, and it's so small it would probably be about the size of your living room. And so this was, of course, Nazareth was a little tiny town, and Jesus comes to this town, and he's preaching in the synagogue, teaching in the synagogue, and they became astonished and said, where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? They go on to ask, is this not the carpenter's son? Everybody knew him. I mean, you could fit everybody into the town in this little tiny place. Is this not his mother called Mary, and his brothers, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? Notice the names. And the first one mentioned is James. And his sisters, they're not mentioned. Are they not with us? Where did this man get these great things? If James, if Jesus was just from this little tiny town. You know, messiahs don't come from little tiny towns. And we're told in John chapter 7, verse 5, that not even his brothers were believing in him. After all, Jesus was their brother, and yes, he was a good guy, but Messiah? But Son of God? That was just a bit too much. And James and his brothers did not believe in Jesus until the resurrection. And that changed everything. James the skeptic became James the believer. That happened with so many, where they saw the risen Jesus, and now they believed. And now James is writing because he has come to see that Jesus is much more than just big brother, that he's the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah.